Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana May and
Jackie Sanders. We're two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday. So today we are going to be talking all about solo exhibitions, things you have to keep in mind, what you need to prepare for, because often as emerging artists, a lot of us start with group exhibitions. And one of the best parts about group exhibitions is that there are generally one or two coordinators that take care of a lot of the logistics. So once you apply, once you get accepted, all you have to do is typically deliver or ship the work to the show by a specific date, and then you just show up and have fun. It's a great time. But when it comes to a solo show, things can be a little bit different.
Yeah, and as we, talk through this episode, we do want to make a quick distinction at the beginning, and these are kind of the terms that we use. Essentially, if we're calling it a solo showcase, we're referring to a solo where it might be in a library or a local business. It generally doesn't have an opening reception or other type of programming associated with it. So you may hear us refer to it, especially if you know some person, a CV entry solo. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it, but it carries a much different workload than the other type. So when we call it a solo exhibition, on the other hand, we're generally referring to an exhibition that's taking place at an art venue. It may have an opening and closing reception. There may be artist talks or other programmings involved. And generally, time and expenses that you're going to spend with it are going to be much higher than a solo showcase. So with that being said, they both have their merits, and some of the things that we're going to discuss may apply to both. So here are some of the things to consider before applying to or and accepting an invitation for a solo exhibition or showcase. So first off, logistics. So artwork details and artist documents, statement, bio, photos of the artist. I mean, this is pretty standard across the board. You're going to be looking at any drop off. Actually, there's acceptance dates, drop off dates, delivery dates, install dates, the installation date. There's a lot of that involved, as well as anything that's involved with the pickup and the install. Also, if you're shipping, that's something else to consider. When does the artwork need to be delivered by? When does it get shipped back? All that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, so there are all of those dates that you need to mark your calendar for, plan out probably 2-3 months in advance. But also thinking about social media content of when can you announce that this exhibition is coming up, what material are needed, which we'll talk about later too. But also, if there is an opening reception, the actual logistics of the reception. What are you responsible for? What is the solo exhibition responsible for? Even if you have a solo showcase, which, as Adriana said, can be seen as like a CV entry solo or even just like a solo display, the logistics of, will they allow you to have an opening reception if you're hosting it? Closing reception, that's also super popular. And an artist talk of some sort. Maybe there's an artist talk that goes along with the exhibition, maybe a workshop, or just other special programming that coincides with the solo display or exhibition. But that's all logistically things that are added on to your plate as the artist, which is kind of that double-edged sword, which we'll talk about the pros and cons throughout this conversation. But it is added workload that you have to think about. It more than just applying online, shipping artwork, and calling it a day, because the attention's all on you and your work.
Yeah, absolutely. And then something extremely important to consider is whether or not there could be a potential overlap with other commitments. It can be hard, especially if it's an invitation that you got for a show 6 months, in the following year. But time flies, and then, you may have several exhibitions and perhaps something overlaps, and then it just makes things a little more complicated. Speaking from experience here, it's not impossible, but better to have those dates already mapped out, and then you can move things around as needed far in advance. But money is definitely a consideration, and depending on the artist's financial situation, of course, and financial state of their business. Definitely something to think about. Obviously, and this is conversation for another day, grants and other ways to raise money for these things, but to just keep it simple. Um, in terms of having a contract up front, it might be worth asking if they don't mention it, or when that conversation starts for an invitation or you're applying, if it's not all detailed out there in the open call. You want to basically ask who's going to process the transactions. Can you have the painting, like, can the collector give you the money and then you give them what their cut is, or how, or do they have to do it? Do they have an online shop that they're going to put it in? Like, how are they going to handle payment when somebody says, hey, I love your exhibition, I love that piece, how can I get it, how can I take it home? What are the commission percentages if applicable? A lot of times, depending on the institution, some of the smaller ones will be charging you a nominal fee, but they may also add on top any credit card fees, something to consider. Others may say, no, we'll take 50, and that includes, any taxes and things that, or credit card fees, etc. So definitely get clarification on that. um, Transportation, shipping, postage to the show, and or if you make a sale, who's going to handle that? Are they handling getting the person to buy it, but then you're responsible for shipping it? Like, who's going to handle that? Are they going to pay for the shipping? Are you going to split the shipping, whether it's there or to a customer? Definitely super important. Um, Another one, which I believe this might be an easily overlooked but definitely important one to bring up, is especially if it's an invitational, are they going to provide you with a stipend or an honorarium of some sort for your time? I mean, they are asking you to put your art there and perhaps not sell it straight to your collector for a certain number of times. So, for the potential missed opportunity, especially if no sales are being handled during the exhibition at all, or nobody's taking that payment, um, and adds more hurdles to that customer to get it, then are you going to get something in return of that risk you're taking by having it there? So definitely something to look into.
Yeah, and especially touching on the point of kind of hidden fees or hidden potential opportunities for income for you as the artist. Thinking about events. So if you have a solo exhibition, oftentimes there'll be an opening and a closing reception, or a closing reception. But even with the solo display, the idea of, are you going to have events with the solo display? And for either of those situations, what about the drinks or the charcuterie board or a food truck that might be outside? Are you in charge of either logistically coordinating that and financially going out and buying the drinks, buying the table, the silverware, buying the food, all those things, as well as entertainment for that event, whether it's a live DJ or live music, some kind of music performance or dancers that coordinate with the work. Who is in charge of scheduling that and who is funding that as part of the event? As well as marketing that goes along with the event, but also the exhibition itself. So who's in charge of print materials, whether postcards or brochures or an exhibition catalog that really dives into you and your work and the history behind the pieces that visitors are seeing? Who's printing that brochure that visitors get to take with them? Is that your responsibility to fund it, or is the gallery funding it, or is the restaurant funding it? Which also goes along with advertising, of posters out in the community, listings on the online platforms, message boards, all those different marketing avenues, and some of which are do require money up front to fund. So who's in charge of that? Which also leads into who's invited to the solo exhibition and opening event. Which as artists, this is a huge opportunity for us to really lean into our warm market, really lean into whoever is a current collector of your work, fellow artists in your community that you want to invite to the event, as well as, of course, everyone on your social media and newsletter list, and family, friends, really anyone that you've come across in the community, whether at a community center or putting flyers up, that you would want to come and experience your work, celebrate your work. As an artist, this is a huge opportunity having a solo exhibition compared to a group show, which, as we're talking about the kind of rolling list of things to think about, it is a lot more on your plate. But The events are typically what kind of is that ribbon on top of the cake. It's kind of that like, okay, you can finally breathe for a second and have everyone come and celebrate you and your work. So you want to definitely make sure you lean into your warm market when you're inviting people.
Yeah, and it's awesome too when, as part of what the venue is charging, for their commission, it includes them inviting their own list of people. So it's a great opportunity, where they can reach out to other contacts. They may have curators and art professionals that they know, art consultants and placemakers as well, that they know that they can personally invite the venue itself or the curator that's helping you put this thing together. But also, I like to think of it as a quote unquote perfect excuse for you to also reach out. Maybe these are folks that you are not 100% familiar with. They may not be warm market, as Jackie called it. But there may be people that may be interested in your work, and you might just say, like, hey, I have this thing going on. I'd love to see you there. But you're not really asking them, it's not a stretch request at that point. Especially if you've done your homework and if you're abstract, maybe don't send it to a curator that specializes in portraiture, right? Like at least make sure it's somewhat of a match, for higher chances of them showing up. Um, but that also, speaking of matches, right? Something else we have to think about is the venue itself and your body of work. So, what are the dimensions of the space? Are there any potential limitations with the display system? Some galleries we've attended only have the wire hanging system and it can only be hung up a certain way. If you had something special jutting out of the wall, they just don't have the system for it. So, something to think about. Do you have enough pieces to fill the space without overcrowding, or the opposite, it looks too sparse? I mean, some space between the pieces to breathe, and this is where the curator's gonna, come in and help you out, of course, or the coordinator for the event. They'll help you with that part, but you definitely want to make sure you have enough work. You definitely want to look at your current art inventory versus number of pieces needed. I know this from a lot of different artists, and myself included. It can be tempting to say the space fits 30, so I'm going to make 30 new things. Make it more sustainable for yourself. Look to see what you already have that could fit the theme of the work, or at least the transitional pieces, and then determine how much pieces you actually need. And then obviously, if you have enough time to make more, then go for it. Knock yourself out. That would be amazing. But don't set that kind of pressure on yourself because that can be a little stifling. Now, if this is an exhibition 2 years down the road, then maybe, and depending, what your work ethic is like and how long your pieces take, that might be the way to go. But especially shorter time frames, what do you already have? Own inventory and go from there. And then definitely make sure that you budget time to finish your work. So making time for varnishing, adding hardware, all those things. I mean, it adds up to, if you paint the sides separately of your painting, if there's anything else special you do to it, oil painters, I'm thinking about you. It needs time to dry before it can even be handled. You don't want the curator to put it up on the wall and then end up with a smudge of oil on them. Like, yeah, there's those kind of things that you need to reverse engineer the timelines for. So make sure you take that into account with your body of work and the space it's going to go in.
And now we have just listed a bunch of things that have been top of mind for both of us as we're preparing or have just hung solo exhibitions ourselves. But logistically, this can feel very overwhelming. And there will be parts in the process where, even with as much as you prep, it may still feel overwhelming. But hopefully, this list helps artists out there of just timelines that you have to think about, things that you have to consider and plan for to make your solo exhibition process a little less stressful and overwhelming because ultimately we both feel not to speak for you, Adriana, but we both feel it's a very beneficial process, of course, to have solo exhibitions. Logistically, it can be overwhelming, but the whole point of us as artists, in addition to the creative process, is to share our work with the world, to get more people to see it. And there's a huge benefit too of having your work in a brand new space. So people that are out of their routine or go to the same galleries often, they'll be able to experience your work, maybe discover you as an artist they didn't know that you were a local artist. Especially if you don't have a community facing studio, if you're working out of your house or out of a private studio, this is a great way for people just to see your work who may not have previously, as well as get some exposure from a press standpoint. And as we mentioned, put it on your CV to get that extra level of experience and credibility for future exhibitions moving forward. Plus, as the artist, it always is helpful to move our art outside of our studio to see it in new light because we too also get new perspective on your work. When you put a painting next to a piece that you did yesterday versus a year ago, they always speak to each other, and those conversations can be super, super rewarding too. So, even though there's no guarantee of sales, even though it is a big time commitment and logistics commitment, of figuring out all of these things. Solo exhibitions are a great, great way to get your work out there, gain perspective on your work, and just as a way to celebrate all the amazing work that you're doing in the studio. It's so much fun.
Yeah. And there's two, final thoughts as we come to an end with this one that I want to leave you with. One, sometimes, people will only see your work online and you're giving them a chance to see it in person. I mean, photos can only take it so far. So they get to interact with it, especially larger pieces where it has an immersive experience. I mean, you can't beat that, right? So that's one thing to think about. The other one that comes to mind with me, and why would you even bother with attempting a solo exhibition or any kind of exhibition for that matter, is a lot of us are deadline driven or deadline motivated, I guess is the better way to think about it. So knowing that you have a date that you're working towards can energize you to actually set parameters and give yourself goals and dates to complete them by. So it's a great opportunity to kind of bring some of that all together. But with that, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. And yeah, that's a wrap.
As always, our blog will be linked in today's show notes where you can find episode notes and links to all of our other podcast episodes.
If you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share what you have learned, you can follow us on social media, Metamate Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Or if you want to stay connected to the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.